Some of the most powerful civilizations on Earth rose in Africa, and most people were never taught their names, not because they were weak, not because they were small, and not because they failed to build kingdoms, cities, armies, or systems of learning. They were erased from the story. That is the uncomfortable truth. When many people think of ancient history, they think of Rome, Greece, Persia, China, maybe Egypt. But Africa is often treated like a blank space, as if nothing truly powerful came from it until outsiders arrived. That story is false. Ancient Africa was not empty, it was not silent, and it was definitely not waiting for civilization. It already had it. It had empires, it had trade networks. It had rulers who controlled wealth on a scale the wider world could not ignore. It had cities of stone, cities of scholarship, and kingdoms so formidable that later generations tried to deny Africans had built them at all. So today we are going to uncover a truth that should have been obvious from the start. Africa was home to superpowers, and once you see them clearly, you start to ask a bigger question. Why were you never taught this properly? Let's begin with a kingdom that completely changes the way ancient history should be understood: Kush. Most people know Egypt. Almost nobody is taught to take Kush seriously. That is a mistake. Kush rose in Nubia, south of Egypt, and it became one of the great powers of the ancient Nile world. This was not a minor neighbor, not a tribal fringe, not a footnote. Kush had kings, cities, armies, trade, and ambition. And at one point, Kush did something that still shocks people today. It conquered Egypt. Yes, conquered Egypt. A kingdom from the south took control of one of the most famous civilizations in human history and ruled as pharaohs. That single fact should destroy the old idea that ancient Africa was somehow passive or peripheral. Kush was powerful because it understood geography and power at the same time. It sat along vital routes of trade. It had access to wealth, prestige goods, and strategic position. It built political authority and military reputation. The Kushites were known for their archers, feared enough to be remembered for it. But here is what makes the story sting. A kingdom powerful enough to rule Egypt should be famous. Instead, for many people, it barely exists in the version of history they were given. That is not an accident. That is erasure, and Kush was not alone. Far to the east, another African kingdom was rising, one that proves Africa was not only strong inland, it was also connected to the world. That kingdom was Axum. If Kush ruled the Nile corridor, Axum mastered international trade. Centered in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, Axum sat near the Red Sea, one of the most important commercial highways of the ancient world. And in history, location can become destiny. Axum traded with Arabia, with the Mediterranean world, with Persia, and with India. This was an African kingdom plugged into global exchange, profiting from movement across sea lanes and trade routes that connected continents. Think about what that means. This was not isolation. This was strategy. This was an African power positioned at the crossroads of commerce, and Axum was not pretending to be a civilization. It acted like one because it was one. It minted its own coins. That matters. In the ancient world, minting coins was a statement. It meant authority, stability, and political confidence. It meant a kingdom saw itself as powerful enough to define value on its own terms. Axum also built monumental structures and became one of the earliest major Christian kingdoms in the world. Again, this is not marginal history. This is central history, hidden in plain sight. By now, the old stereotype should already be collapsing. Ancient Africa was not outside civilization. It was shaping civilization. But if you want to see just how rich and powerful African states could become, you have to move west. Because West Africa did not just join global trade, it helped drive it. This is where the story of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai begins, and this is where gold becomes power. The trans-Saharan trade changed history. Gold moved north. Salt moved south. Caravans crossed brutal desert routes carrying goods, wealth, and influence between regions that depended on each other. And African states learned how to control that flow. The Ghana Empire was one of the earliest great powers to dominate this system. By sitting in the right place and commanding the exchange between valuable resources, Ghana turned geography into wealth and wealth into power. That matters because powerful states do not rise from chaos alone. They rise from organization. Trade must be protected, routes must be managed, taxes must be collected, authority must be enforced. This was not accidental success. It was structured power. Then came Mali, and Mali would become one of the most legendary empires in world history. Most people know one name from Mali, Mansa Musa, and yes, his fame is real. His wealth stunned the wider world. His pilgrimage became the stuff of legend. Stories of his riches spread across continents. He became, for many, the symbol of unimaginable wealth, but the real story is even more powerful than the legend. Mansa Musa was not the miracle. Mali was. No ruler can display that kind of wealth unless the state behind him is already organized, productive, and politically strong. His journey did not create Mali's greatness. It revealed it. That is the key. The empire was already there. The systems were already there. The wealth was already there. Mansa Musa was simply the moment the rest of the world was forced to notice, and Mali's greatness was not only about gold. It was also about knowledge, because within its world rose one of the most important cities in African history, Timbuktu. Today, some people use the name Timbuktu like it means some distant nowhere place. Historically, that could not be more wrong. Timbuktu was famous because it mattered. It was a center of trade, scholarship, manuscripts, and learning. Scholars taught there. Students traveled there. Books circulated there. Ideas were preserved and debated there. That is civilization at a very high level, and it breaks another lazy myth. Africa was not only producing wealth, it was producing intellectual life, serious intellectual life. Timbuktu reminds us that greatness is not only measured in armies and treasure. It is also measured in what a society chooses to learn, preserve, and pass on. That makes the silence around it even more revealing. Because if people knew more about Timbuktu, it would be much harder to keep pretending African history lacked complexity or brilliance. And then, after Mali, came Songhai. If Ghana helped establish West African power and Mali made it visible to the world, Songhai expanded it. Songhai became one of the largest empires in African history. It controlled major cities, trade routes, and river systems. It had military force, political structure, and real administrative reach. This is important because it shows that African empire was not a one-time accident. It was a pattern. One major state rose, another adapted, another expanded. That tells you there was continuity, not randomness. Songhai proves West African power was durable, scalable, and sophisticated. These were not isolated kingdoms living in obscurity. These were organized states shaping the flow of commerce and authority across huge regions. And yet even after Kush, Axum, Ghana, Mali, Timbuktu, and Songhai, some people still cling to the idea that Africa had no great civilizations. That lie becomes impossible to defend once you look south. Because in southern Africa, there was a civilization so impressive that later outsiders literally refused to believe Africans built it. Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe was a major urban and political center, connected to long-distance trade and built with astonishing stone architecture. Its walls, enclosures, and scale still command attention today. This was not a myth. This was not a fantasy. This was real African statecraft in stone. And when later outsiders encountered the ruins, many could not accept what was in front of them. The structures were too sophisticated, too monumental, too impressive for the racist story they already believed. So instead of accepting the evidence, they looked for other explanations. Anyone but Africans. That reaction tells you everything. Great Zimbabwe was not denied because the evidence was weak. It was denied because the truth was too powerful. It shattered the lie, and that is what links all of these civilizations together. Kush, Axum, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, they were different from each other. Different regions, different cultures, different political systems, different moments in time. But they all prove the same thing. Africa was making history. It was building states. It was commanding trade. It was projecting power. It was creating centers of learning. It was connecting deserts, rivers, and seas to the wider world. So why were these superpowers pushed out of the mainstream story? Because history is not only about what happened, it is also about who gets remembered. For centuries, colonial narratives needed Africa to look backward, dependent, and incomplete. That lie made conquest easier to justify. It made domination look like rescue. It made theft look like civilization. But that lie could never fully survive the evidence. Not with Kush ruling Egypt. Not with Axum minting coins. Not with Mali flooding the imagination of the medieval world. Not with Timbuktu preserving scholarship. Not with Songhai governing empire. Not with Great Zimbabwe rising in stone. The truth kept surviving. In ruins, in records. In oral traditions, in manuscripts, in memory. And that is why this history matters now. Because when people are taught that a civilization had no past, they begin to underestimate its future too. Erasure does not just steal memory. It steals confidence. It narrows possibility. It teaches generations to look away from greatness that was always there. But once you see ancient Africa clearly, the old story loses its power. You can no longer say Africa was empty. You can no longer say Africa was outside civilization. You can no longer say greatness came only from somewhere else. Ancient Africa was not waiting to be awakened. It was already awake, already ruling, already trading, already building, already shaping the world. And maybe that is the real reason these stories matter so much, because they do more than correct the past, they restore proportion. They remind us that Africa was never a footnote in human history. It was one of its authors. So the next time someone says Africa had no ancient superpowers, understand what you are really hearing. Not history, but the absence of history, and those are not the same thing.